smell of cedar never leaves a woodworker's hands. I've tried everything over the years. Lemon juice, baking soda, that orange-scented mechanic soap my wife used to buy in bulk from Canadian Tire. Nothing works. After 40 years of building custom furniture in my garage workshop in Kelowna, the cedar is just part of me now. My late wife Miriam used to say she could always find me in a crowd just by following the smell. She wasn't wrong. I'm 68 years old. I retired 4 years ago from a career most people around here would recognize. 31 years as a senior credit officer at a regional credit union that stretches across the interior of British Columbia. If you've ever needed a commercial loan for a construction project, a winery expansion, or a small business anywhere from Kamloops to the Okanagan Valley, there's a reasonable chance your application crossed my desk at some point. I approved some. I declined others. I always tried to be fair. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because it matters to what happened last October. My son Callum is 34. He has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which is a dangerous combination, but has served him well. He works in environmental consulting, spends half his time driving logging roads in the Caribou, and the other half writing reports that nobody reads but everybody needs. He met his fiancée, Petra, 3 years ago at a conference in Vancouver. She works in commercial real estate development. Smart woman. Driven. I liked her well enough the first time. Her mother is a woman named Rosalind. Rosalind lives in West Vancouver, not North Van, not Burnaby. West Vancouver, which she mentioned in the first 15 minutes of meeting me. She wears her money the way some people wear cologne, too much of it, and you notice it before anything else. Her late husband had been in development too, built a small empire of condo projects up the sea-to-sky corridor before he passed. Rosalind had inherited the business, kept it running, expanded it. She was proud of that. She should have been, but pride is one thing. What she did with it is another. I remember the Saturday I drove down to meet them for the first time. Callum had been nervous on the phone the night before. More nervous than I'd heard him since he was a teenager, asking to borrow the truck. He'd warned me, gently, that Rosalind was a lot. I told him I'd handled loan applications from cattle ranchers, mill owners, and one very aggressive winery operator who showed up to his appointment in rubber boots. I could handle a mother-in-law. We had lunch at a restaurant in Yale Town that I will not pretend I could find again without GPS. The kind of place with no prices on the menu and bread that arrives in a paper bag on a wooden board. Rosalind was already seated when I arrived. She looked me over the way a building inspector looks at old plumbing. She was polite enough through the appetizers. Asked about Kelowna. Asked what I'd done for work. I told her, credit union, 31 years, retired now, do some woodworking and volunteered with a mentorship program for young tradespeople. She nodded like I'd described something quaint. Like I'd told her, I collected stamps. By the main course, she'd redirected the conversation toward the wedding. Callum and Petra wanted something in the fall, outdoors, somewhere in the Okanagan. There was a vineyard property outside Oliver that Callum had his heart set on. Beautiful place. I'd been out there for a friend's retirement party years back. Good wine, good views, and they do events on the terrace overlooking the valley. Rosalind said she'd already spoken to the event coordinator there and had some thoughts about the guest list. I asked how many people she was thinking. She said 220, maybe more. I looked at Callum. He was looking at the breadbasket. I stayed quiet through dessert and drove the 3.5 hours home up the Coquihalla, thinking that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Rosalind was just enthusiastic. Maybe this was just how people in West Vancouver talked about things, with that particular certainty that the world would arrange itself according to their preferences. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. I kept giving it for the better part of 2 years. Callum called me on a Wednesday evening in mid-October. I was in the workshop, fitting a set of drawer slides into a blanket chest I'd been building for a neighbor. The phone rang, and I pulled off one glove to answer it. He didn't say hello. He just said, "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." That's never a sentence that leads somewhere good. He told me that Rosalind had approached him and Petra together the previous weekend. She'd laid out what she called her vision for the wedding. The revised guest list, the preferred seating arrangements, the vendors she'd already had preliminary conversations with. And then she'd said something that Callum struggled to repeat out loud. She told them that the reception dinner would be, in her words, a curated gathering of people from relevant professional and social circles. That the evening portion especially needed to feel elevated. That she wanted the room to reflect the caliber of the life Petra had built. And then she'd said that my presence at the reception might complicate the tone she was trying to set. Callum read me the exact phrase from a note he'd written down. I still have the note. He texted it to me later that night. I don't know why. Maybe he needed a record of it, too. She had said, "Your father is a lovely man, but he doesn't quite fit the profile of the evening we're planning. We'd love for him to be part of the ceremony, of course. The ceremony is family. The ceremony is family. The reception, the dinner, the speeches, the dancing, the photographs, the part of the wedding that people talk about for the rest of their lives. That was not, apparently, for people like me." I sat on my shop stool for a long moment with the phone against my ear. The cedar smell was very strong. The overhead light made a small buzzing sound it's made for years that I've never gotten around to fixing. I asked Callum one question. I asked him what Petra had said when her mother said this. There was a pause. Then he said Petra hadn't disagreed with her mother. She'd said that she thought it might be simpler that way. I told my son I loved him. I told him we'd talk soon. I hung up. Then I sat there for a while longer, alone in the cedar smell and the buzzing light, and I thought about Miriam. I thought about what she would have said. She'd have been angrier than me. She always burned hotter and faster, and I always had to be the one to say, "Let's think this through." I could almost hear her in the workshop with me. "Think it through, Reg." So I did. My name is Reginald Forsyth. People in the Okanagan know that name. I spent 31 years making decisions that shaped which businesses got built and which ones didn't. I sat on the board of the Regional Chamber of Commerce for 9 years. I still consult, informally, for 2 credit unions in the Valley on their commercial lending policy. Nothing formal, nothing paid, just the kind of phone calls that happen when people trust your judgment and want it before they commit to something. I didn't make those phone calls that night. I waited 3 days. I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting from anger. On the 3rd day, I was sure. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something quieter and more certain than anger. It was the knowledge that I had spent 68 years building a name that meant something in this part of the country, and I was not going to watch it be treated like a social liability by a woman who thought geography and net worth were the same thing as character. I started with the vineyard venue. The coordinator there was a young man named, well, I'll leave names out of it, but his father had once come to me for a refinancing on a commercial property in Penticton during a very difficult period, and I had found a way to make the numbers work when another officer might not have. He'd thanked me at the time. People tend to remember that kind of thing. I called him on a Thursday morning and told him I needed to discuss the booking under Petra's name for the following September. I told him there had been some changes in the family circumstances, and that I would be grateful if he could flag any outstanding deposits and let me know the current cancellation terms. He was very helpful. He said he'd look into it. I made 2 more calls that day, one to a woman I know who runs a premium catering operation out of Summerland. She does most of the high-end vineyard events in the South Okanagan, and she'd once needed a character reference letter from me for a licensing application, one to a florist in Penticton that Rosalind had apparently already contracted. I'd helped that florist's husband with a small business loan about 12 years ago. I didn't ask for anything specific. I just mentioned that I'd heard they were involved in a September event and asked them to let me know if there was anything I should be aware of regarding the booking. By Friday evening, 3 vendors had quietly reached out to me. Each of them, independently, had questions about whether the event was proceeding as planned. Each of them mentioned that, given the uncertainty, they wanted to review the terms. The venue called Rosalind on the Monday to inform her that due to a scheduling conflict that had been identified, the booking would need to be canceled and the deposit would be refunded within 30 business days per the contract terms. The catering company called Petra on Tuesday, something about a change in their fall availability. The florist sent an email. I heard all of this through Callum, who was, at this point, bewildered and increasingly upset, not with me, because he didn't know yet that I was involved. He called me on the Wednesday and said everything was falling apart and Petra was furious, and Rosalind was on the phone with everyone trying to figure out what was happening. I listened. I said that sounded very stressful. I did not lie to my son. I want to be clear about that. I didn't tell him I had nothing to do with it. I just didn't tell him yet that I did. There's a difference, and I was waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a Saturday afternoon about 2 weeks later. Rosalind had insisted on a meeting. Her word, meeting, like we were colleagues in a boardroom. She drove up from the coast. Callum and Petra drove over from Vernon, where they'd been living since spring. We met at Callum's place. I drove in from Callina. Rosalind looked like she hadn't slept well. She was still put together. She was always put together. But there was something around the eyes. She sat across from me at Callum's kitchen table and said that she didn't know what was happening with the vendors, but that she was going to sort it out, and she wanted to know if I had heard anything through my local connections that might explain the issue. She said local connections the way you might say regional dialect. A little patronizing, a little amused, a little dismissive. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at Petra. Then I looked at my son. I said yes. I had heard some things. And then I told them exactly what I had done and why. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use language I'd be embarrassed to repeat. I simply explained that when I was told, through my son, that I didn't fit the profile of the evening that was being planned, that I was welcome at the ceremony, as family, but not at the reception, as a guest. I had decided that if my presence wasn't valued, perhaps my professional goodwill didn't need to be either, and that, in a valley as connected as this one, goodwill travels in both directions. The kitchen was very quiet. Peter said, "Mom," very quietly. Rosalind said, and I'm being precise here, she said, "You did this deliberately." I said yes. She said, "Do you understand what this has cost us?" "The deposits alone," I said. I understood the deposit terms very well. I'd read the contracts. There was a long silence. The kind that has weight. Then Callum said something I wasn't expecting. He looked at Petra and said, "You told me you thought it was simpler. That was the word you used. Simpler." Petra didn't say anything. He said, "He's my dad. He built half the furniture in my apartment. He drove to every hockey game I ever played, including the ones in Revelstoke in January. You said simpler." I watched my son say this and felt something I don't have an easy word for. It was grief and pride together, folded into each other. Petra started to cry. Not dramatically, quietly. The way people cry when they know they've done something they can't quite explain. She said she'd been trying to manage her mother and that it had gotten out of hand and that she was sorry. She said she was sorry to me directly. She looked at me and said it. I told her I appreciated that. Rosalind did not apologize. She gathered her things with great precision and said she needed some air and left through the front door. I could see her through the window, standing on the front step with her arms crossed, looking at the street. I made tea. Callum sat down. Petra sat across from him, and they talked in a low, careful way that I was careful not to hear too much of. After a while, I said I should head back to Kelowna before it got dark. The highway through the canyon is no place to be tired. Callum walked me out to the truck. We stood in the driveway for a minute. October in the Okanagan has a particular smell. Dry leaves and cold coming down off the mountains, and underneath it's something sweet and fermented from the vineyards. It's one of my favorite smells in the world. He said, "You could have just told me." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you?" I thought about it for a moment. I said because I needed him to see it for himself. Not the vendors, not the canceled bookings, that wasn't the point. I needed him to hear himself say it out loud, to hear what it sounded like when he said the word simpler. He was quiet for a bit. Then he nodded. I drove home on the highway with the mountains going dark on either side and the valley lights coming on below, and I thought about what a person is, really, when you strip away the titles and the property values and the curated guest lists. I thought about Miriam, who grew up in a small house in Salmon Aram and never once needed to make herself more impressive than she was. I thought about the blanket chest in my workshop, still waiting for its final fitting, built from cedar. I've been saving for 2 years because I wanted the grain to be just right. Some things are worth taking time with. Some things you build slowly and carefully, and you don't rush them because you know they have to last. The wedding, when it eventually happened, a smaller affair 7 months later, at a friend's property outside of Naramata with maybe 60 people and a potluck-style dinner that Callum's friends from university helped organize, was the best wedding I've ever attended. I gave a toast. I danced badly to a song I didn't know. I sat next to Petra's grandmother, who is 81 and originally from Newfoundland and has opinions about everything, and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Rosalind was there. We didn't speak much, but at one point, late in the evening, she passed me in the narrow hallway between the farmhouse kitchen and the back porch, and she stopped, and she said very quietly, so that no one else could hear, "You made your point." I said nothing. I just nodded once, because the point hadn't been for her. It never was. It was for my son. And for the quiet knowledge that after 68 years, I know exactly what I'm worth. And it has nothing to do with which room I'm allowed to sit in. I drove home that night with the cedar smell on my hands and the valley dark and full of stars, and I thought that Miriam would have laughed at the whole thing. Not meanly. Just that bright, quick laugh she had when life turned out to be exactly as ironic as she always suspected it would. I still hear it sometimes, in the workshop, when the light buzzes and the wood smells right. Some things stay with you. The good ones especially. I've been thinking about what Rosalind said to me in that hallway. Not the words exactly. I've already told you those. But the tone underneath them. You made your point. Said the way someone concedes a parking dispute, not the way someone recones with what they did. And I realized, standing there in the narrow farmhouse hallway, with the smell of someone's potato salad drifting in from outside, that she still didn't fully understand what had happened. She thought I had played a game and won it. She thought this was about strategy. It wasn't. It never was. What she couldn't see, and I don't know that she ever will, is that what happened to those vendor bookings wasn't something I manufactured out of spite. It was the natural result of 31 years of showing up for people, of returning calls, of finding solutions when the numbers were hard, of treating every application that came across my desk like it belonged to a real person, with a real family, and a real stake in the outcome. That's not influence you borrow. That's something you build. Slowly, the way you build anything that lasts, and when you've built it honestly, it doesn't disappear when you retire. It just changes form. Callum asked me once when he was maybe 17 why I bothered being careful. He'd watched me spend an extra hour on paperwork that nobody would check, on a file that was already approved. I told him then what I believe now, that the point of doing something right isn't the result is just evidence. The point is the habit, because the habit becomes the person. And the person is what stays behind after the result is long forgotten. Rosalind had built something too, in her own way. A business, a reputation, a careful architecture of the right people in the right rooms. I don't fault her for that. What I fault her for, what cost her, in the end, was the assumption that her architecture was the only one that mattered, that a man who smelled of cedar and drove 4 hours on a highway to watch his son play hockey in Revelstoke in January wasn't worth accounting for. That's not a small mistake. That's a failure of intelligence, not just of manners, because the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one or the wealthiest one. It's the quiet one who knows exactly who they are and has nothing left to prove. I'm not a vengeful man. Ask anyone who knows me, but I do believe, completely and without apology, that the way you treat people accumulates. Every dismissal, every small condescension, every moment you decide someone doesn't fit the profile, those accumulate too, not as punishment waiting to be delivered, just as reality, building itself out of every choice you make. Petra looked me in the eye and apologized. That mattered. That was character showing itself under pressure, which is the only time character is ever real. Callum said the word simpler back to her with a weight that told me everything I needed to know about who my son had become. That mattered more than anything else that happened that day. I drove home through the October Valley with 68 years behind me and, God willing, some number of good ones still ahead. The cedar chest is finished now. It's sitting in my neighbor's bedroom. The grain turned out exactly right. Some things are worth the time it takes to do them properly. That's the only lesson I know how to teach. It's the only one that held.